finishing up my master's, which was done by James Hitchmore and a few others, where essentially they found out that native plants, and that this is not just flowering native plants, but native plants in general, were typically of a higher value to insects when studied, and even plants that came from Europe, and especially plants that came from the southern hemisphere. And whilst all of those other plants were useful, they were nowhere near as useful as the natives. And at the same time as that, one thing that stood out starkly was a study that was conducted, which was a sort of side piece, which was that native trees are absolutely vital, and that non-native trees tend to have a very low ecological capacity. So I would 100% recommend leaving native plants if they look lovely, but also using native trees. And there are not a great number versus the number of trees in the world, but there are a good number of trees which you can use structurally and aesthetically in your garden, which are native, which will be obviously having that sort of positive impact. So yeah, I think it's important that we focus on creating more of a habitat for nature than specifically focusing on the fact that, let's say, an aster does well for a honeybee, both of which aren't native, so we have no idea that that's doing any good for any other insect.
Yeah, that's very true. There's also the problem that a lot of plants get demonised in sometimes ridiculous ways. I mean, I leave ragwort in my garden, which I know is the food source for the Cinnabar moth, and I live in quite a rural area, so I'm very careful that it sort of stays within, I try and keep it in the middle of my garden. But are there any other plants that you think that have had really bad press that are actually very, very good for wildlife? Because I think the Cinnabar moth, although I have seen it on other plants, I have also read that it is the sole food source, which I don't actually believe, because as I say, I've seen it and I've heard of it munching other things. But for some of these things that we are so keen to get rid of, they will be perhaps the sole food source for certain species. So are there any that are really unfairly demonised that you can think of?
One personal love of mine on the sort of wild plant front at the moment is all of the thistles. And there are lots of different types of thistles in the UK, many of which in their own right, in the right habitat, look absolutely stunning. There's a marsh thistle, which is Circeum palustre, which where we live in Devon, is, it carpets this area of rushy, slightly wet meadow. In the evenings, if you were to walk up through these thistles when they're flowering, it's absolutely carpeted in moth. That's just one example. One other thing that I do know is crucial is that if you were, for example, to sow a meadow in your garden, which obviously I think is a lovely thing to do, not only aesthetically but biologically, quite a lot of our meadow butterflies specifically lay their eggs on types of grass. And obviously that grass requires being longer than 2 millimetres or 5 millimetres or whatever. And so, yes, there are a lot of interrelationships or symbioses with various plants and various butterflies. You can do a lot to obviously add to the overall dynamism of your garden by potentially leaving areas a little bit more wild, because you don't necessarily have to study every single butterfly and where, which grass it lays its eggs on, but there's a high likelihood that one of the grasses in that wilder area, one of the butterflies will. And so you'll wake up one summer morning and there'll be butterflies all over your garden where once there weren't. And it's not to do with the fact that you've got lots of flowers. It's actually just to do with the fact that you've got a little bit of long grass.
Yeah, oh wow, that's interesting.
So it is fascinating, that one. And obviously the more into it you are, the more you read about it, the more you realise how many things not necessarily just go and pollinate one plant, but actually lay their eggs specifically on one plant. And that's obviously quite key to keep the generations going. One thing I wrote down actually was that on the same subject as your ragwort, I had a lovely experience this summer when I was walking through, it's so parched everywhere. And there's this meadow that the Avon Wildlife Trust did in Bristol. And it just looked stunning because there wasn't hundreds and hundreds of plants of ragwort, but there were about 30 or 40 that just stood erect and above the grass height. It reminded me of the prairies and goldenrod, and I thought, amazing, here's our own version of goldenrod, looking absolutely stunning with butterflies all over it. yeah, I'm a bit of a fan of ragwort myself at the moment.
Yeah, it's a good plant. It really is. I don't know how it survives anyway, because when I went out to look at mine, it was absolutely shredded to pieces. There was not one bit of it left. So whether it will have had the chance to seed around or come back next year, I don't know. But it was stripped. So I should think the moths do a good job of keeping it, in check anyway.
Well, yeah, I suppose the natural order of things would dictate that slowly but surely it evens out. But ragwort requires open ground to germinate. So the reason you see such massive proliferations of it sometimes in the countryside is nothing to do with the ragwort's fault. It's because somebody has potentially not looked after their field enough and has not moved on livestock before they've poached the ground, and so it opens up the ground to ragwort, which loves to colonise their patches.
Right. So is there anything that I probably shouldn't allow in my garden? It's not a huge space. Is there anything that's particularly badly behaved that I really should hoik out?
Well, I wrote down a couple of things for this actually, because obviously everybody's got their pet hate.
Yep.
I was chatting to a guy who digs drains the other day, and he hates willows because they get in his drains. So if you don't like things getting in your drains, then get rid of willows. But brambles, obviously in a small space, will take over so rapidly that there's really little you can do than to try and either keep them ultra contained somewhere or just get rid of them, because they keep coming back. They're great for wildlife too, but I think in a small space, there's not enough of it.
Yeah.
Blackthorn, similarly, if you have a blackthorn sucker that gets in under a fence or something, it'll just keep running, and eventually you'll have a thicket. And realistically, blackthorn loves to be hacked down. It was once, eaten by all sorts of grazing animals, so it naturally wants to regrow. So I would say blackthorn can be something you should try and keep a check of. And at the same time as that, nettles. Everyone says, have a little patch of nettles in your garden. Well, if you have a small space, then a patch of nettles could be quite a valuable space, and they will just continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah. So don't get me wrong, if you have space for nettles and they're amazing for lots of butterflies, then by all means have some. And they're great for tea as well. But if you've got a small space, then I think nettles just, you can do without them. There's a lot of other plants that do well.
Yeah, that's true. Dock is my personal bugbear, so I do get that out. But then that's a shame, because I think I've probably taken some out that are the different type. I think they're the meadow dock, and they're actually beautiful. So you do need to be a little bit careful, I suppose, when you're waging war on these things. Are there any ornamentals that would compete? Because again, I've left my kind of wildflowers in a separate area to my ornamental bed, but actually I am going to try and mix the two together. So what would compete with the wilder species?
I always take the view that once upon a time the ornamentals that we all have in our gardens were once wild. So once again it comes back to the study of plant diversity and ecology to work out what might work in the right place, and that's where I always start with design. I've done some trials on this at home in some test beds that we sowed with a standard UK meadow mix, and then put in lots of different ornamental perennials from pretty much all over the world. And I found that things like Persicaria bistorta, so that one's good. There's lots of different thalictrums seem to work as long as they're from Europe. The sort of well-known Cirsium rivulare, the sterile clone, the Atropurpureum, can hold its own. It's holding its own really well in quite a sort of damp meadow that I've sowed. The slightly taller Achillea filipendulina, that one, which actually I think comes from the steppe in Russia, but from wet places on the steppes, done perfectly well, has actually increased in size. A lot of the asters do pretty well. European digitalis, so foxglove species. Our standard foxglove obviously needs a bit of bare ground. The rusty foxglove and the woolly foxglove have been absolutely fine. And again, you need to disturb the ground every now and again to reinvigorate the seed and let the seeds set on bare ground. But again, that's about a management thing. And interestingly, the last one, there's a grass actually I think comes from North Africa called Penicetum macrorum, which is absolutely stunning. It's a sort of big version of the standard little Penicetums that you see, but it's got a much more compact, more sort of elongated head. Stunning. And actually everybody always says it does terrible things in the standard ornamental bed because it just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
So I thought, well, I'll chuck it in the grass and see what happens. And it's created this beautiful sort of architecture within the grass, but it's just slowly creeping out. It's perfect for that job. So I suppose in all, it's about finding and looking at plants. And I think more and more are going to emerge through all the studies that I'm doing where this happens. And look for the plant that naturally lives in those kind of scenarios anyway, and you'd be surprised at how well they sometimes do.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the key to having a landscape or a garden that is lower maintenance. If you can get the plant communities right in the first place, then you're not constantly fighting against nature, and things should reach a much easier equilibrium. So I think we will get better at that. I think we'll do less of this artificial propping up of our borders and more of our actually planning things sensibly and observing, because as you say, you're doing the work now, and I think people like James Hitchmer and Nigel Dunnett have been doing the work for a while, and maybe not people like Noel Kingsbury, but actually there aren't that many people who are going, do you know what, we've got to get sensible with this, we've got to actually look at what works next, and what can work cheek by jowl. It is going to be trial and error for people, especially in their own sites which have got their own specific conditions. So there is an element of the unknown about it, but it's definitely an interesting journey. So if people wanted to grow plants that were slightly more in their kind of wild form, you can't always buy those in nurseries. So what would you suggest people do if they want to get hold of things like that?
It depends on the sort of garden centre or nursery that you go to, but there are a couple where I have actually started to notice 9cm pots of some of our native meadow species. So that's encouraging for sure. It is hard to find very specific native-only or near-native plant selections, and at the same time as that, have a knowledge that you're only essentially looking for those plants, because there are lots of nurseries out there who will be suggesting lots of different plants, and they'll come from all over the world. So if you're keen on reining back your scope and looking at, I think Europe's a better version of our sort of nativeness than just England. We're only a tiny extension of Europe, and as a consequence, all of our plants post the Ice Age came from there anyway. So most of the European plants that you can find will probably do pretty well in our scenarios. It's just they didn't happen to get here when the Ice Age retreated. But there are a couple of great websites, actually. I don't know if you know of Emma's Gate or I think it's wildseed.co.uk. I spend a lot of time looking through their selections, and they grow on a lot of plants and then take the seed. You can actually purchase the seed and then either sow it into a meadow or sow it into a border if you wanted to, or, as me and my mum quite often do, bring on the plants so they're slightly larger, and as a consequence you can put them into more drastic scenarios and see how they do. Yeah. So they've got a little bit more bulk. The last option is that I don't think it's illegal to take seed off the heads of the plant.
Right.
So in the autumn, very regularly we'll go out seed collecting, so that you actually may well find a very vigorous strain of a certain native plant that then obviously you can potentially put into a new scenario and see if it works. So that's quite interesting, and I would highly recommend doing that if you've got some species-rich meadows nearby. Bear in mind, you're not allowed to dig up any wild plants, so absolutely don't do that. Especially if it's something like an orchid, because orchids rely on a fungus to actually live from. So if you dig up an orchid, you're condemning it anyway. It's not going to live in a pot.
Right. So don't do that.
Yeah, so don't do that. But as we move forward in this kind of more holistically looking way of designing, it's likely that there's going to become more and more people from the supply side actually suggesting these plants in a more sort of pointed manner, rather than just being part of a big stock of plants from everywhere.
And the other thing that I think might be useful to mention is there probably aren't a huge amount of them, but can you recommend any good books or websites for people who are thinking about doing this in their own gardens?
Yeah, definitely. Start with The Wild Garden by William Robinson. And I've actually got the version which is forwarded by a guy called, I think it's Rick Dark. Yeah. And that's a fantastic book to basically go into the mind's eye of the man who first thought about gardening with nature. So it's a tone, it's where you should begin. It's absolutely phenomenal how so many of the plants that we all use today were the ones that he was using and trialling. The Dynamic Landscape is a little bit more of an educational book, something potentially more for the professional, but if you're really keen, I would highly recommend it. It's almost a group of scientific papers written by the likes of Nigel Dunnett and James Hitchmore.